Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay. Um, sad news to report. The death of Jim Crockett Jr., aka Jimmy Crockett, who was the former promoter of um, Jim Crockett Promotions slash WCW. He was basically the godfather of WCW. He was the man. He was one of the only two men in all of wrestling history, to compete with Vince McMahon. Has passed away at the age of 76. But like I said, he was one of the only two men in history to ever compete with Vince McMahon on that level. And he competed with him in the 1980s. Um, Jim Crockett Jr. was a lot like Vince in the sense that he was born to a wrestling father who was a wrestling promoter. The original Jim Crockett promotion started in the 1950s, and primarily it was a tag team territory. You had Johnny Valentine and Johnny Weaver, the Kentuckians, who um, one of the members was Jody Hamilton, the Masked Assassin, Nick Patrick's father, and um, acts like that. It was based in the Carolinas, North Carolina and South Carolina. Um, Charlotte, North Carolina was the main city, and the main arena that they would perform in is the Greensboro Coliseum. But in addition to that, um, he owned several minor league baseball teams and hockey teams, and he also organized some of the first integrated rock and roll concerts that had half black and half white um, patrons in it in the South. This was senior. Now, much like in the WWE, when the son took over, Jim Crockett Jr. took over, he had he had ambitions to expand beyond Florida and beyond the Carolinas and Virginia. See, the WWE started um, all the way up in Maine. The WWE's territory started all the way up in Maine and ended in Virginia and Washington D.C. And the top of Virginia is when the Crockett territory started. But Jim Crockett Jr. wanted to expand beyond uh, just the Southeast, and he wanted to become a national promotion. So he does that on the back of Ric Flair, on the back of Wahoo McDaniel, and on the back of Ricky Steamboat. Three guys that he gets from Vern Gagne's AWA. He brings them in from Minnesota, the Minnesota territory, and he starts to build his promotion around it in the 1980s. And in 1980, he becomes president of the largest governing body of professional wrestling, the National Wrestling Alliance, and um, starts to fulfill his ambition. Then in 1984, Vince McMahon is also doing that. Vince McMahon has now taken over the territory from his father in the Northeast, like Jim Crockett Jr. had done in the Southeast, and he buys the Georgia territory from Ray Gunkel. Ray Gunkel dies in the ring. His wife takes over, and she can't really um, she can't really handle the territory. So the Briscoe brothers Jack and Jerry Briscoe and Ole Anderson sell the rights to the Georgia territory to Vince McMahon. You have Black Saturday, in which Vince McMahon appears on the television show, the Georgia Championship Wrestling television show that was renamed World Championship Wrestling. And he basically sells Ted Turner, who's the network head at the time, a bill of goods. Like, he tells him it's going to be a great show. It's going to feature live matches just like the Georgia Championship Wrestling did. It doesn't. So Jim Crockett steps in and he buys the promotion from Vince McMahon for $1 million. And the money that Crockett gave to McMahon is the money that McMahon used in 1985 to launch the first WrestleMania, to finance the first WrestleMania. But, which was on closed circuit television. Crockett already had experience in closed circuit television because his dad, during the Thanksgiving holiday, much like a lot of other wrestling promoters at the time, would promote wrestling matches. So in 1983, he decides to have a closed circuit super show that he calls Starrcade, main evented by then NWA champion Harley Race and Ric Flair in a cage, and Ric Flair wins the NWA championship for the second time. He won it the first time in 1980, which was when Crockett became NWA president, and he won it again in 1983. And now from 1983, that's really 83, 84 is when Crockett really starts to get the ball rolling with national expansion and starts to promote cards in Chicago, starts to promote cards in Florida, starts to promote cards out in the West Coast because he has the national TV of WTBS. So the whole country is able to see his products. And with Dusty Rhodes as his booker, they bring in the Rock and Roll Express from the Mid-South Territory. They bring in the Midnight Express. They bring in Jim Cornette. They start the Four Horsemen with Ole Anderson and Arn Anderson and Tully Blanchard, and then later Barry Windham in 1988. And in 1988, they launched the Great American. 1987, they launched the Great American Bash with the first War Games. And like I said, they even went to Chicago. They even went to New York. They went to Vince McMahon's backyard. They couldn't get the rights to Madison Square Garden because obviously Vince McMahon has that unlocked. That relationship with the Garden goes all the way back to Vince McMahon's grandfather when he used to promote boxing fights there. But they're able to get the Nassau Coliseum in Long Island, and they have the Bunkhouse Stampede there. It's a complete failure, but they have it there. It's a battle royal that Dusty Rhodes wins. But here's the thing. Vince McMahon wanted to be the only national wrestling promotion in the country. So he starts to run counter program to Crockett. Crockett would have a show on WTBS. A pay-per-view like Starrcade 87. And Vince, to counter that, says, well, if you're going to run Starrcade 87, then you can't have the rights to WrestleMania 4. Now, keep in mind, in 1987, they had the WWF had their most biggest year with Hulk Hogan versus Andre. in the Pontiac Silverdome. So the cable companies are cramming to have WrestleMania 4 because WrestleMania 3 was such a success. But they also want to carry Crockett because the cable companies think, oh, well, we'll have a package, on cable where we run wrestling all day. you know, we'll have Vince McMahon's Survivor Series, and then we'll have Crockett's Starcade back to back. McMahon says no. You have to run Survivor Series exclusively, excuse me, or you cannot have WrestleMania 4 the following year in '88. So this, of course, hurts Crockett's business. In addition to not having Magnum TA in the main event, it was leading up to Magnum TA versus Ric Flair for the NWA Championship, and Magnum TA got into his motorcycle accident, so they replaced him with Ronnie Garvin. So in addition to not having the main event that they wanted for Starrcade '87, they also don't, they don't get a lot of viewers because a lot of cable companies don't carry them. They rather carry WrestleMania. So 1988 is a semi bad year for Crockett. I mean, late '87 going into '88. But then when Vince McMahon when Vince does air WrestleMania 4, Crockett decides to air a show on free TV, the first Clash of Champions, featuring a young and up and coming star, Sting, against Ric Flair, which they go to a draw. And this is the event that makes Sting into a national name, and what would make Sting the franchise of WCW. It ran against WWE, which was running WrestleMania 4 at that time, and of course, being on free TV, it got more views than WrestleMania 4 because WrestleMania 4 was on pay-per-view, and Clash of Champions was on free TV. So he did, Crockett won in that case. But again, when Vince McMahon launched the first Royal Rumble, it was against one of Crockett's shows, Starrcade '88, when he had Flair and Luger. Vince said, okay, two can play at that game, and got the USA Network to put on the first Royal Rumble to counter Starrcade '88. And Starrcade was originally on Thanksgiving. They had to move it to Christmas in order to counter the success of Survivor Series. So these two guys, Vince McMahon and Jim Crockett, they went head to head in the 1980s, and Crockett never had made more money than Vince, but he had a better wrestling product than Vince. In the 80s, Jim Crockett Promotions and the NWA was known for better wrestling. Like the WWF had Demolition, but Jim Crockett had the real thing. They had the Road Warriors. The WWF had the Rockers, Shawn Michaels and Marty Jannetty. NWA had the Rock and Roll Express, the real thing. WWF had the Beverly Brothers, and NWA had the Midnight Express, the real thing. So they had the better wrestlers. Ric Flair was a better wrestler than Hulk Hogan. If you had a main event with Ric Flair in the NWA, you were guaranteed to get your money's worth. Ric Flair and Ricky Steamboat had some knockdown dragouts, both in the 70s and in the 80s. But in 1988, um, Jim Crockett decides to buy out Bill Watts' territory. Now, Bill Watts' territory was a third tier territory. It was originally known as the Mid South Territory. Then he tried to go national. He tried to copy Crockett and McMahon, and Watts tried to go national, and he made the UWF. And because of the oil bust in the late '80s, attendance was down, so he really had no choice but to sell to either of the two big ones, either to Crockett or to McMahon. And um, he eventually sells to Crockett, and the money that Crockett uses to buy the UWF, he never really gets back. He just goes into debt. He moves his central headquarters from Charlotte, North Carolina to Dallas, Texas, and he brings in a couple of guys like the Steiners and Sting that were mainstays in Jim Crockett promotion. Mid South Wrestling, and makes them mainstays in Jim Crockett promotions. But ultimately, he doesn't really utilize the UWF guys in the right way because, like Jim Cornette said, Jim Cornette, a guy who worked in both territories in the '80s, he worked in Mid South when it was really hot in the mid '80s, like 82, 83, 84, and worked in Crockett when it was really hot in 85, 86, 87, and 88. So they were not on the same TVs. UWF was, for the most part of its history, it was a local promotion, whereas NWA was a national promotion. Everyone around the country saw the NWA guys just like they saw WWE guys, but everyone around the country did. If you didn't live in Mississippi or Louisiana or Oklahoma or Arkansas or Southern Tennessee, you didn't really see the UWF guys. So Crockett makes a bad investment there, and in 1988 he has to sell his promotion, his family's promotion, to Ted Turner, and eventually Ted Turner leaves the NWA, and WCW is born. But Jim Crockett is really the godfather of WCW because what was his promotion, Mid Atlantic Wrestling, or the JCP, the Jim Crockett Promotions, was what became WCW. Of course, they moved their headquarters to Atlanta, and they were in Atlanta for most of the '90s. But his family always really stayed involved with WCW, especially his brother, David Crockett, and even him with WCW up until the time when WCW closed its doors in 2001 when the WWE bought it. But yeah, there was that wrestling war in the late '80s between Crockett and McMahon, a game of one-upsmanship. Um, Crockett has a pay-per-view. Vince has to have a bigger pay-per-view. Crockett does two venues for Starrcade '86, the Omni in Atlanta and the Greensboro Coliseum. McMahon has to do three venues for WrestleMania 2. McMahon does WrestleMania 3. Crockett has to do something big like the Crockett Cup or the Bunkhouse Stampede. Then Crockett has Starrcade '87. McMahon has to have Survivor Series. Crockett does Clash of Champions on free TV. McMahon does the Royal Rumble to counter Starrcade '88. McMahon goes to Chicago. Again, Vince McMahon went to the Rosemont Horizon for WrestleMania 2. That's where he had the Battle Royal with Andre. Andre the Giant won that Battle Royal with the NFL players. Crockett has Night of the Skywalkers with the Road Warriors and the Midnight Express. So all throughout the 80s, Crockett and McMahon were always one-upping each other. Crockett would do something, McMahon would do something. McMahon would do something else, Crockett would do something else. McMahon would do this, Crockett would do that. So it was a complete game of one-upsmanship until 1988 when Crockett sold it. And then even after 1988, Crockett forms what he calls he wants to break away from the NWA and form what they call the World Wrestling Network. And originally, Joel Goodhart, the original promoter for ECW, because before 1993, even Todd Gordon wasn't the original owner of ECW. A guy named Joel Goodhart was, and he was in partnership with Jim Crockett Jim Crockett Jr. to start promoting wrestling again. But it never really got off the ground, and Crockett remained underground for the rest of his tenure. When Ted Turner bought the company, they put him on as a consultant, but they never really consulted with him. They brought in Jim Herd, they brought in Kip Fry, they brought in Bill Watts, and later they brought in Eric Bischoff. And of course, Eric Bischoff, he had the most success more than other promoters because he was the one who competed with Vince. Again, Crockett competed with Vince in the 80s. Bischoff competed with him in the 90s. They both lost. They both suffered a lot of the same problems. They kept using the same guys on top, and they had active wrestlers booking the territory. Eric Bischoff had Kevin Nash booking in the late 90s in WCW, and Crockett had Dusty Rhodes booking in the late 80s. So they both, when a wrestler is booking, of course a wrestler going to book himself in all the big storylines, which is what Dusty always did. Like the reason Tully Blanchard and Arn Anderson left Jim Crockett in the 80s was because, and the Road Warriors, why they went to WWE, was because Dusty Rhodes always put himself on top. Well, the Road Warriors left because they didn't like Jim Herd. That's why Ric Flair left too. But Tully Blanchard and Arn Anderson, especially Tully Blanchard, left the company because Dusty Rhodes would always put himself on top. See, Vince McMahon, well, up until very recently when Triple H married Stephanie McMahon, Vince McMahon would never let well, I take that back because during 94, 95, Shawn Michaels and Kevin Nash and Razor Ramon, I was going to say he never let a wrestler really run the promotion, but the Clique was running the promotion in 1995, and you saw where that got them. WWF's ratings sank to an all-time low, and it took Eric Bischoff and the NWO to spike it back up. But Jim Crockett's biggest mistake, in the Death of WCW DVD, which was released in 2011 or 2012 about WCW, they say what really caused the death of Jim Crockett was that he expanded too far. Like he went to try to go to Chicago, he tried to go to New York, and he should have just stood in his southeastern territory, and that was it. And buying the mid-south wrestling and not utilizing those wrestlers. correctly, except for Sting and the Steiner brothers. He didn't really utilize Dr. Death Steve Williams. He didn't really utilize the Freebirds. Um, when UWF went national, Terry Gordy was the first champion of UWF. Dr. Death Steve Williams was the second champion. These were the stars of UWF at the time when Crockett bought UWF. But um, uh, he didn't utilize them. He didn't really utilize Dr. Death. Dr. Death was like in one War Games, with the Freebirds, um, and the Midnight Express and the Road Warriors, and that was it. So other than the Steiner brothers, and I think he just got Rick Steiner because Scott Steiner wasn't he wasn't wrestling at that time. Um, when Because I remember Rick Steiner as a heel with Mike Rotundo and Kevin Sullivan in the Varsity Club in the late 80s. But anyway, all those WCW Saturday nights and, you know, from the 80s is all on the WWE Network now. You can watch that, and also the Death of WCW documentary has Sting, the NWO, Eric Bischoff. Doesn't have Vince Russo. That's a little bit more down the line. But RIP to the Godfather of WCW, Jim Crockett Jr., and the legacy that is the Crockett territory in the Carolinas. Another good documentary from Kayfabe Commentaries that interviews J.J. Dillon is the Back to the Territories documentary that Jim Cornette put out. And it was J.J. Dillon because, of course, J.J. Dillon worked backstage with Crockett. He helped Dusty book. When Dusty went over there in early '84, when he left the Florida territory, Eddie Graham's territory, which was his home territory, and he went to Crockett. Dusty and Crockett set the territory on fire to compete with Vince, and J.J. Dillon was one of his main lieutenants. And then when Crockett sold the territory, J.J. went to the WWF. But, of course, when Vince McMahon wouldn't give J.J. an increase in his salary because he has a son with cerebral palsy, JJ was forced to go to back to WCW, and we work behind the scenes at WCW. Now he's a correction officer. He's no longer in the wrestling business, but he worked very closely with Crockett and in the Crockett territory, and he goes through the history of the Crockett territory even before Crockett Jr. takes over. When Crockett Sr. was there, like I said, when it was mostly a tag team territory, Johnny Valentine was there. They say Johnny Valentine was like the original Undertaker. Like the way he would wrestle, his style was like Undertaker. What I know from Johnny Valentine, besides being the father of Greg Valentine, Greg the Hammer, is that he was the guy in the plane crash with Ric Flair in the 70s. When Ric Flair broke his back, Ric Flair was just starting out. He was U.S. champion at the time. He was U.S. champion at the time, and it said Ric Flair would never wrestle again. Johnny Valentine was one of the guys that was in that plane crash. I think it was 73 that Flair was in that. Of course, Flair went on to be one of the greatest wrestlers of all time and 16-time world champion. So they were wrong. And one of the last times I remember seeing Jim Crockett on WCW was the one they did in Greensboro. Starrcade '93. When Ric Flair beat Vader to become the 11th-time world champion. Crockett was there because, of course, it was the 10th anniversary of Starrcade. It was a big event. It was on the level of WrestleMania 10 with WWE. It was a big event for Jim Crockett. But I just think it's kind of cool how he and Vince parallel each other. Like, he was a minor league baseball team owner, and Vince's grandfather was a a Negro League baseball team owner in the 20s. And they're both second generation promoters, and they were both rivals to each other. So that iconic scene of Crockett standing behind the World Championship Wrestling sign where Tony Schiavone, he gave Tony Schiavone his start first in minor league baseball and then in wrestling. And it was crazy that he died yesterday on a Wednesday for two reasons. One, because he's the godfather of WCW, and commonly on the internet, there is a meme that on Wednesdays you have your WCW, your Women Crush Wednesdays, and also and also because um, um, AEW, I think to me, since AEW is on TNT and WCW was always on Ted Turner's networks, Nitro, WCW Saturday Night, and Thunder. AEW is the successor to WCW. They're the competition for WWE right now as of 2019. So um, it was crazy that he died on a Wednesday. R.I.P. to Jim Crockett, Big Jim Crockett. Jimmy Crockett Jr., not Big Jim. Jim Crockett Jr., the Godfather of WCW. Peace, guys. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And watch some WCW today. Watch some classic WCW because that's the legacy of Crockett. Peace.